For more on Mr. Trump's remarks, Professor Tim Harcourt, Chief Economist at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance from the University of Technology, Sydney, joins us live now. Professor, thank you for making the time to join us today. What do you read into President Trump's outlook on the economy? Was he able to address the public's cost of living concerns?
I think he spent a lot of the speech. It was unusually for President Trump, a totally disciplined, scripted speech. He tended to blame most of the cost of living pressures on the Biden administration and the Democratic members of Congress, and made a lot of the lower inflation numbers now in the US and some of the improved growth and incomes per capita figures. I think most of it was basically trying to blame the Biden administration and taking credit for his own economic agenda, particularly on the inflation front, but probably more to do with his foreign policy, as outlined in the speech by Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Munich just last week.
Along with blaming the previous administration, he also hit out at the Democrats for wanting large tax increases. And he promoted, the tax cuts in his so-called big, beautiful bill. But didn't he also impose billions of taxes on Americans with his tariffs?
Well, it's a good point, isn't it? Because ultimately, a tariff is a tax on your own consumers. It's like putting rocks in your own harbour, as the famous British economist Joan Robinson used to say. But somehow he's made tariffs more about foreign policy and using it as strategic leverage, in the same way that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping used tariffs against Australia rather fatefully because they hurt the Chinese economy. Once Xi Jinping started using tariffs as a tool of foreign policy, I think that gave the green light for President Donald Trump to do the same.
There's some confusion on the tariffs because, the Supreme Court has basically blunted his favorite geopolitical tool, but he claims that he won't need congressional approval to keep them in place. How could he do that? Is that even possible?
Well, a third of the tariffs imposed are still outside the Supreme Court ruling. What the Supreme Court said was that you can't use the emergency powers that the president would use without congressional approval for sanctions at a time of war. For instance, it's very unusual for you to use that power to impose tariffs. In fact, the word tariff is not mentioned in that provision. It's mainly about emergency sanctions. So what the Supreme Court is saying is, well, it's up to the president whether he wants to impose tariffs or not, but he can't use this provision to do so. So it looks like he might use other provisions to impose the 15% tariffs across the board that he's threatened to do so now.
He highlighted what he called a transformation like no one has ever seen. He mentioned that incomes are rising. What were the main takeaways for you from his speech?
Look, I think watching his speech and reading his speech again, for me, it was a direct follow-on of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State's speech in Munich, which was pretty much a geopolitical transformation where, and unusually for a Republican president and Secretary of State, they said that the end of the Cold War meant that we thought we could have open markets, as in no tariffs, and we thought we could have open borders in terms of mass immigration. And they've now said, well, this is in effect a folly. We have to be very careful about mass immigration. We have to be very careful about trade and the international economy. And we've sort of deindustrialized America to trading partners that have actually become strategic geopolitical enemies. And so now's the time to sort of reindustrialize America and take a lot of industries and a lot of jobs back. So it's quite clear from President Trump's State of the Union address and Marco Rubio's speech that it's a whole new direction. It's not a traditional Republican free market approach at all. It's something quite different, quite much more economic, populist, and much more nationalistic than what we've been used to from Republican presidents. It's Trump's own style and Trump's own agenda.
More populist, as you say. I guess with the midterms coming up in November, key voter issues were his main focus, such as the cost of living and affordability. He highlighted lower gasoline prices and lower mortgage rates. What do you read into his comments on those points?
Well, I think more and more as the midterms, as they approach the midterms, they'll concentrate on economic issues more and more. Even Gavin Newsom, the California governor, who is potentially a Democratic presidential candidate in 2028, he said himself that the Democrats are too obsessed with identity politics, pronouns and the like, and they need to get back to bread and butter economic issues. Trump is basically saying he's already there, and that's the types of things, the hip pocket type issues that will always affect voters, not some of these other side issues. So I think in a way, Governor Newsom really revealed in some ways the territory in which the midterms are going to be fought.
I want to turn our attention to something that President Trump announced. He mentioned a new initiative called the War on Fraud, and he said that will be led by Vice President J.D. Vance. What could have prompted this, and do we have any idea what it might focus on?
Look, I think in some ways there is concern about government waste. We saw Elon Musk playing that role at the beginning of this second Trump administration. And also I think there's a view they have to give J.D. Vance a big job to get his profile up. Marco Rubio has been a very high-profile, energetic Secretary of State. And I think Lyndon Johnson said something not very flattering about the role of what the Vice President's role is worth. So they probably do have to give J.D. Vance more profile so he can lead his own presidential campaign in 2028. And also, government fraud and government waste and getting rid of it is on the Trump agenda, and it's actually very popular with the electorate.
Looking at his speech as a whole, do you feel President Trump used the opportunity to deliver a forward-looking agenda, or was this all about touting his achievements so far?
Oh, he's not very shy about boasting about his achievements. That tends to be his modus operandi. I think it was partially agenda, partially look what I've done. I've got the country moving again, particularly economically, and I've had some success on the foreign policy front. And he did spend a bit of time, lashing out at his Democratic opponents at the Biden administration, and indeed the justices of the Supreme Court that knocked off his tariffs. So he had a few brickbats as well as a bit of congratulations, and he made a point of saying that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was the best Secretary of State that they've ever had in history. I guess Benjamin Franklin might have a question about that, but certainly he spent a fair bit of time with congratulations to his own cabinet.
With there still being a lot of trade and tariff uncertainty, what should we be watching out for in terms of risks after President Trump's speech there?
Well, there's always uncertainty and risk. We saw that with Xi Jinping's tariffs and also President Trump's liberation tariffs. I think some exporters around the world will be feeling liberated from the Supreme Court, but he'll still impose them in some ways. And it's no accident that Don Farrell, the Australian Trade Minister, has headed to Washington and also to Europe to finish up the Australian-European Union Free Trade Agreement, because I think a number of allies are now wanting to form low tariff free trade agreements with themselves because they know that we're in for a pretty tough time with the White House going forward.
President Trump, his approval ratings have been sliding, specifically when it comes to his ability to handle the economy, which is something that he really touted when he was campaigning for the job. Do you think what he said today could perhaps bring voters back on his side? Or what more does he need to do to convince Americans that he's got things on track?
Yeah, it's interesting because even when performance is not that high, people tend to say the Republicans have done very well on the economy compared to the Democrats. So I think probably what he needs to do is to show that his economic credentials are better than the Democrats, and he can use governors and Congress members as a fodder on that basis. But I think a lot of his unpopularity was to do with the ICE incident in Minneapolis, where even middle-of-the-road voters thought he'd gone too far, even though his base would have supported it and his opponents vehemently opposed it. But for the most part, all he has to do is do better than the Democrats on the economy and other issues to get his people over the line. But remember, the president himself is not on the ballot at the midterms. It's actually the Senate and members of Congress.
Thank you, Professor Harcourt, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Tim Harcourt from the University of Technology, Sydney.